Good morning. How are you guys? Everyone in a good mood today? Good. Okay. All right. Um, Hopefully I can keep it that way. Um, excuse me. That's my goal. Man, this week I was something kind of cool happened. It's not that big of a deal, but it just really struck me, especially in light of what my mind's been on in preparing for this message today. Is Thursday night we had worship in the park, and some of you were there. We had a good turnout. We had a good time Thursday night in the park, and man, we got one more of those, by the way. If you haven't made it, or even if you have, come join us. Not this Thursday, but next Thursday for our last worship in the park for the season. But it was a lot of fun on Thursday nights up at Pike Place. But getting ready for it this week, I wanted to, on the iPhones right now, you have to get the adapter for your headphone to plug in. On the newer iPhones, you have to plug into it. Well, I have an iPad, and it's the same thing. I have to have an adapter, the little dongle thing you have to plug into the bottom, but it's not the lightning adapter. Y'all don't care. It's the USB-C one, and I have to go around looking for it. Anyway, I needed one. I wanted to play music through my iPad Thursday night, and so I'm running all over town looking for one. So I go to Walmart, and I go in and I look at their section where they have the Apple stuff, and it's completely empty. Nothing is on the shelf. Shocking at Walmart. I know. And so I go to find one of the associates to come over and to see, to scan it and to see if they have one in the back or anything like that. And they're saying, well, it's saying we have one, but it was probably stolen. Okay, and so we're looking around. Well, by the time as I'm looking, about three of the associates had come over, and they're all kind of trying to see if they can figure out a solution and this kind of stuff. Really wasn't that big of a deal. But one of them, one of the associates, she goes, you know what? I have one out in my car. If you want it, you can have it. And I was just like, well, no, I'm not taking yours. It just kind of made me stop for a second. I was thinking, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not that desperate for it. I'm not going to take yours from you. So anyway, I said, I'll go look around a little bit more. So I went a few other places. I went over to the AT&T store next to Jimmy John's, see if they had one because they carry iPhones. They didn't. Went to Kroger because you never know what you're going to find at Kroger. And I was hungry. And Then I went into Gordman's. I looked around in there, no luck or anything like that. So I drive down to the little Verizon store down here on 231. And I'd never been in there before. I go into the Verizon store, and I'm looking around in there, and I ask them, and they start looking around. The same thing at Walmart. About three different people are emptying shelves looking for this. No one can find it. And the guy says, you know what? He goes, I've got one at home. I'll drive home right now and go get it for you and bring it back, and you can have it. And I was just like, okay. No, I was just kidding. Just kidding. I didn't make him do it. I was just like, no. I said, I really am not that desperate, even though I've been to 8 stores today. I can wait. I'll order it on Amazon or something like that. But I was like, man, it just made me, really, that's the whole point. It just made me stop and think, man, there were two different people. Generosity tells you about somebody's heart, When someone's generous like that, when someone's willing to self-sacrifice, that had nothing to do with their being an employee at each of those stores. They were stepping beyond that, and it became personal. Here I am, praying for one, and I think I ended up being the one for a couple of people. You know what I mean? It was an opportunity for them to speak to me and to kind of bless me. And their generosity, it got my attention. It made me just really kind of like, that's kind of cool that you're willing to do that. I really appreciate it. It meant something to me, especially in light of the message I was preparing for today. There's a story about a little boy who goes into a soda shop years ago, and he climbs up to the counter, and a waitress comes out to him, and the little boy says, "How much is it for an ice cream sundae, a chocolate ice cream sundae?" And she says, well, it's going to be 50 cents. And so the little boy starts digging around in his pockets and looking for the change, and he's counting out his change. And after a couple of minutes, he looks back up at her and says, how much just for a plain ice cream? And she says, 35 cents. And so he gets back, and she's got her tapping her foot, hand on the hip, just kind of rolling her eyes. This little boy's fishing around in his pockets. And finally, he pulls out a quarter and 2 nickels and sets them on the counter and says, I want a plain ice cream. And so she goes to the back, and she gets his ice cream and brings it out in a dish with a spoon and sits it there. And she goes back to the back while the boy eats his ice cream. Some time passes, and she goes back to check on the boy, and she comes out and she sees that the dish of ice cream is empty, and the little boy's gone. And so, okay, he's done. So she goes to pick up his dish, and when she does, she sees laying under the dish 2 nickels and 5 more pennies. And it just caught her breath. And that little boy had enough money for an ice cream sundae, but he wanted her to have a tip, and that meant so much to her. And man, generosity does something. Generosity says something about who we are, about our heart. It says something about going beyond what's required and just saying, this is who I am as a person. I want to give. I care about people, and I want to have an impact on people's lives in that way. We're talking through this series right now, getting your house in order. Last week we talked about getting our priorities in order, and this week we're going to talk about, because we can't ignore one of the most critical and important aspects of getting our house in order. It's getting our finances in order. Now, I know that this is a topic that most of us hate to talk about. Our finances, for a lot of us, are a source of stress. A lot of times, most of us, I think, probably consider our finances to be very personal and private. We don't like it when people try to tell us how we should manage our money. We like it even less when we feel like someone's trying to get our money from us, right? Now, I know that there are a lot of people, and maybe some here today, who think that all the church, and maybe more specifically, all the preacher really cares about is getting a hold of your money. And I know that that's a thought out there, but I'm asking you and I'm challenging you to come into this message today with an open mind. While giving to the church is certainly going to be a part of our discussion today, that's not really what this message is about. And I want you to hear that. This message isn't just about giving. This message is about understanding and learning how to manage your finances, and how that's a very important part of getting your spiritual house in order. And today, that's where I want us to go. You see, getting your financial house in order was definitely on Jesus' mind during the last week of his ministry. As Jesus came, and last week I talked about this, that we see as we face the end of something, that is when we're going to deal with the things that matter most. And that was true of Jesus and his ministry as well. The things he wanted his disciples to keep in mind. And Jesus, as he comes into the last week of his ministry, getting your financial house in order was definitely a part of what he dealt with. As a matter of fact, dealing with money and resources and finances and wealth was a big part of Jesus' whole 3-year ministry that were recorded in the Gospels. Out of Jesus' 38 parables that are recorded in the 4 Gospels, 16 of them dealt with money or resources or possessions in some way. 1 out of every 10 verses in the Gospels deals with money and possessions. 288 verses in just the Gospels alone deal somehow with money and possessions. Why? Why do you think that's true? Because Jesus knew this truth, and he wanted his disciples to understand this truth, and he wanted us to understand this truth as well. And this is the truth, that the true Lord of your life is often revealed by your checkbook. The true Lord of your life is often revealed by your checkbook. Today, we have to talk about getting our financial house in order, not because I want you to give me or the church all of your money, but because how you manage your money says a lot about who the Lord of your life really is. For some of us, I'm afraid that our King, the Lord of our life, is not Jesus. It's the almighty dollar. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that, because I want you to understand this. Jesus did not intend or mean for us to be poor and miserable. That had nothing to do with Jesus' teaching on money. As a matter of fact, Jesus wanted us to have a good, healthy, and appropriate relationship with money and possessions. In Jesus' ministry, he clearly shows us how we can learn to manage our money and resources in such a way, not that we shun money, not that we give it all away and that we have nothing and that we live in poverty, but so that we have a healthy, reasonable relationship with our finances. Even God dealt with this in the Old Testament with his people. Proverbs 3:9 and 10 says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. Job, in the book of Job, was dealing with the fact he was a wealthy man who God had blessed with possessions. God had blessed with a lot of livestock and servants and a big family. And all this in one moment was wiped out. And as he's in his mourning, as his family has been taken from him, as his wealth and his farm and everything had been taken away from him, and as he's mourning this and the people around him are causing him to question, Job, what have you done to anger God? Why don't you just curse God and die? He says this in 121. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job had a healthy relationship with money. He had a healthy relationship with his possessions. He knew where it came from. Even entertainer P.T. Barnum, the subject of the movie The Greatest Showman that's been popular the last couple of years, he, in all of his mistakes, in all the ways he handled money, came to an understanding of what a healthy relationship with money looks like in this quote when he says, money is in some respect life's fire. It is a very excellent servant, but a terrible master. And I think P.T. Barnum and Job and Jesus, never thought you'd have those three compared in one sentence, did you? All three of those had a healthy understanding about our relationship and what God intends our relationship to be with possessions and with money. There's a key question I want to ask you today, and I want you to think about. I want you to ask yourself this question. Are your finances a tool for living, or are they the master of your life? And I'm not just talking about love of money. I want you to understand that. Yes, Timothy tells us, and Paul tells us in Timothy, love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, right? That's not what I'm not just talking about the love of money. I'm talking about being controlled by it. And some of us are in that place right now where our finances are such a stress, trying to make the next payment and whatever, that money is driving us. It's controlling us. Is it a tool that you're using in your life, or has it become a master of your life because of the stress that it puts on you, or the desire that you have for it, or the way that you use it and manage it? You see, how you honestly answer this question reveals a lot about you, your heart, and what you need to do if you want to get your house in order. And so what I want us to do is I want us to go to the one place that we can trust for guidance, the Bible. And specifically, like I said before, the last week of Jesus' life. And I'll be honest with you, this is an area of my own personal life that I'm trying to figure out how to get in order. I don't have all the answers. As I stand up before you today, as I preach on this topic, I'm not coming at you as if I've got it all figured out. And there are some areas in my own personal life, in our family's personal life with our finances, that we're trying to get our house in order, and that we're trying to figure out how to apply the principles that Jesus taught in Scripture. You see, I don't think I have all the answers. I know I don't, but I believe Jesus did. And so as we go to look at what he had to bring us, I want us to look at 5 principles as we look into the last week of Jesus' life that I think he lays out for us to help us learn how to apply to our lives so that we can learn how to manage our finances and get our house in order. So let's look to the Master to see what he has to say. We're going to be looking at a story specifically in Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 14. And this is a story, if you've been in church for any amount of time, you've probably seen it before. But let's focus on it in the context of what we're talking about today. Jesus, during the last week of his ministry, makes it a point to tell this story to his disciples because he's trying to help them get their house in order before he leaves them in his ministry. Now let's look at what it says. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more bags. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought in the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you had not sown and gathered where you had not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew I harvest where I had not sown, and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That story gives us so many things to think about in terms of managing our finances. Jesus is laying this out for his disciples. Get your financial house in order. Learn how to have a healthy view of what God has provided you with. And so today I want to lay these 5 principles that we find in this story and throughout the New Testament in Jesus' teaching. These 5 principles start here. Principle number 1 is actually one of our core values here at New Hope. We are managers, not owners. Now that applies to a lot of different things. We've talked about it in application to the church itself. But today we're going to apply this specifically to our finances. We are managers, not owners. If you want to have a healthy relationship with your possessions and your money, start by changing how you view ownership of those resources. When you understand that everything you have ultimately belongs to God, it changes how you want to use and manage those resources. I've got to ask you this question. Is your attitude like this? I'm going to give you 2 statements, and I want you to think which one applies more closely to your attitude towards money. The first attitude would be, I've worked my tail off for this money, and it is mine to do with as I please. Or is your attitude more like this? God has blessed and rewarded my work, and I want to honor him with how I manage those resources. Which one more closely resembles your attitude towards money and the ownership of the money that you have and that you've earned? The truth is, Job understood this. Everything you have is from God. Everything you have belongs to him. Listen, you want some proof? Look at it this way. Turn over to Luke chapter 12 with me, verses 16 to 21. And let's take a look at, here's another parable Jesus uses, and it happens to be about money. Luke 16 to 21 says, and he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I'll store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And this is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. I got to ask you a question. What's going to happen to your wealth, to your possessions, to your retirement fund, to your savings account? What's going to happen to that money when you die? It's not really yours, is it? It never was. You see, everything we have is from God, and everything we have is for God. That's what it means to be a child of God. That's what it means to be a disciple, is to understand that we are simply managers of everything he's blessed us and trusted us with. We are not owners. Guys, if you want to get your financial house in order, start with your attitude about who it really belongs to. That's where we have to begin. That's the first principle. The second principle we find is this: faithful with little, trusted with more. Faithful with little, trusted with more. That's what we see in this story. You see, in the story about the bags of gold that I just read, the master rewarded the servants who managed his wealth faithfully and wisely. And he rewarded them by trusting them with more. On the flip side, the servant who did not handle the master's wealth well had what he had been entrusted with taken away from him and given to someone else. It's a principle that Jesus wanted to show his disciples in the story, that if you are faithful with what he's blessed you with, he will bless you with more. He will entrust you with more. It's not about getting rich. It's about understanding who it belongs to in the first place and doing everything you can with it for him and his purpose, the true owner. The third principle I want to give you is this: build his kingdom to build your kingdom, not the other way around. I know so many people I've talked to, and I think maybe I've been guilty, maybe we've all been guilty of this to a certain degree, is we think, well, I want to build my kingdom to the point that I have enough, that I can do all kinds of things for ministry, that I can give to, I want to grow my wealth to a place where I can bless other people. Great thought, right? But Jesus says, listen, if you want to build your kingdom, start by building his kingdom and let that build your kingdom. There are two ways to look at this, okay? Because the American way has become this idea of work hard to build your kingdom. But Jesus shows that if we work to build his kingdom, then we are building our kingdom as well. You see, the first way to look at this is the servants who were faithful with what they had been given. He ended up giving them more to manage. He ended up saying, give them more, let them take care. Their kingdom grew because Jesus said, you've been faithful with little, I'm going to give you more. But I think there's an even more important principle here. There's a more important way to look at it, and it's this: we are children of God. We are part of his kingdom. If we grow his kingdom, by default we're growing our kingdom because his kingdom is ours. Look at what Romans chapter 8 says. Romans chapter 8, we just looked at this a few weeks ago. Verses 14 to 17, it says, for those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, listen to this, then we are heirs. Heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. If we build his kingdom, we are building our kingdom. It says in Matthew 25:34, this is back to the last week of Jesus' life, just a few verses after the bags of gold story. This is a story, what he says here takes place when he's separating the sheep from the goats. He's talking about the end times when he'll separate the sheep from the goats, and he'll say, well done, good and faithful servant, to those who met the needs of the least of these. You know the passage I'm talking about, right? He says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. If we build his kingdom, we're building our kingdom in a way that really matters, in a way that will last forever. That's a principle we can never forget. Build his kingdom to build your kingdom. A fourth principle that we learn from Jesus is your actions reveal your heart. Your actions reveal your heart. And this comes back to what I said at the beginning, looking at your checkbook reveals your heart. How you manage your money reveals a lot about how you view ownership of your resources. Let's be honest, how you give, your generosity reveals a lot about how you view the ownership of your resources. Do you give to build ministry? Do you give to seek and save the lost? Do you give with a desire to help people? Do you give when a need is put in front of you? How you give reveals a lot about your heart. And the fifth principle I want to give you, the last principle that I see in this today, is give out of faith instead of abundance. Give out of faith instead of abundance. There's a story, if you look in the last week of Jesus' life, we're going to look to Mark chapter 12 right now, verses 41 to 44. And I want you to look, this is a simple little story, but man, it says so much. It says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on." Now I want you to understand, giving out of abundance isn't bad. Giving out of abundance Jesus isn't saying it's bad to give when you have surplus, when you have extra. It's a great thing to be in a position to give out of abundance, especially when we understand that God's blessed us and we want to use that in ministry. But what about when you do not have an abundance? What about when finances are tight and you're not even sure how you're going to make it work till the end of the month? Malachi 3:10 is a passage that is probably used in every giving sermon ever written. But I want you to understand what Jesus is saying, or what God's, through his prophet Malachi, is saying to his people. In Malachi 3:10, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it." And what God is simply saying is, trust me. Trust me when abundance isn't available. That's the kind of faith that will be rewarded. It's a promise. And God challenges us to test him. This kind of giving and managing of our resources is the key to getting our financial house in order. It reflects your attitude about money, and it reflects who really is the King and the Lord of your life. You see, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says in Matthew 6:21, he says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And because of that, that is the answer. Why does Jesus talk so much about this? Why does he talk about money? And why do we need to talk about it so much in the church? It's because Jesus understood this truth, and we need to understand it too. Where our treasure is, that's where our heart's going to be too. We can't ignore this topic if we are going to get our house in order. And listen, I know a lot of times, and I've heard it said 1,000,000 times if I've heard it once, my money is my business. I want you to understand this. Your finances are not just your business. They are God's business too. Because God's the owner and we're just the managers. Take time to examine your finances. Do you want to see your finances improve? I believe if you apply these principles, and yes, I'm talking about giving to the church too, giving to Faith Promise, giving to the ministry and the mission of God, that giving to build his kingdom and to reach our community as much as we possibly can, that's included in this discussion. Take time to examine those finances. Listen, I believe this is absolutely true. If we all began managing our finances based on these 5 principles that Jesus has given, I am convinced that we would never have to ask for extra money so we could fix our well. I'm convinced that we would never, ever have to ask the staff to quit spending money on ministry because we don't have enough right now. And I can tell you right now, as a staff, we realize finances are tight sometimes, and we cut back and we spend as little to nothing as we possibly can. But you know what happens as a result? There are things we're not doing in ministry that we would love to be doing. There are opportunities in ministry that we're missing right now. And I'm convinced that if we all got our financial houses in order and we applied these 5 principles, that would never have to happen again. I'm convinced that if we applied these 5 principles, we would never have to call our missionaries and say, I'm sorry, but we don't have enough this quarter to send out what we promised you. We're going to have to send you a little bit less. We've had to do that a couple of times this year, and I'm convinced that we would never have to say to someone who was living somewhere, who was giving their life to ministry and to spreading the gospel around the state of Indiana, around this country, and around the world, and is dependent completely on churches like New Hope supporting them in that. I'm convinced that we would never have to call them and say, I'm sorry, we don't have what we told you we were going to send you. You're going to have to cut back some on ministry. I'm convinced if we applied these 5 principles, we would never have to send a letter out like that again. So what's it going to look like? What's it going to look like in your life? Guys, I am not going to apologize for preaching about money. Money is critical for us to accomplish the mission of God, for us to do ministry in the best and most faithful way we can. Yes, we will be as creative as we can and do with what we have the best we can. But we have to understand that managing our finances well is a critical part of being a child of God and joining Him in His mission. It's a part of understanding who our finances really belong to and where they came from in the first place. You see, getting your financial house in order shows you to be a faithful and trustworthy disciple of Jesus. The challenge is there. The principles are there. Are you going to focus on them? Are you going to apply them? It's time to get our house in order. Today we're going to have a time of communion. And you talk about giving. Who can possibly give more than their life? And we sit here and we want to talk about how much it might hurt to write a check, how stressed we might be to make ends meet this month. But ultimately what this is all about is we're coming in and we have a Savior who gave everything, who left His throne in heaven, who came to earth and said, I will give my very life for you because I love you and I care about you and I want you to join me in my mission. Communion is our time to remember that, to reflect on it, and to let it challenge us and move us. Let's take time together right now to remember what Jesus has done for us before we start getting all defensive about who wants our money, how, and why. Who's really given the most? You will never, ever outgive God. Let's remember that as we reflect on what it is He gave to us through His Son, Jesus. Will you pray with me, please? Father, thank you so much for your Son, Jesus, and what He did for us on the cross, the example that's been set, the challenge that's been given. God, help us understand, as hard as it can be to let go of what we think is ours, when we start to understand that it's really yours in the first place, and we can trust you completely, God, that this doesn't become so hard anymore. That it becomes the desire of our heart to give because you've given. God, thank you so much for that. Thank you for your Son, Jesus. Let us reflect on that now during this time of communion. In Jesus' name, amen.